Okay, so welcome to our session today on urbanization and social change. So I'm actually, my costume is I am Keith Richard. I am the roadie for Yari Alaranta's band, River Street, several years ago. So if you've ever seen Yari play the guitar, you'll know what I'm talking about. Okay, so our first speaker today is Alan de Bromhead. How do you say your name, Alan?
De Bromhead, yeah.
Bromhead, okay. So please take it away, and you've got 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Bryce, and thank you everyone for joining. Obviously, as Cormac said, it'd be nicer to be there in person, but we'll have to do what we can with the virtual environment. So this paper today is joint with my colleague, Ronan Lyons, from Vampire University in Dublin. I'm sorry, Trinity College in Dublin. He's joining virtually as well, as you can see there in the little picture. Okay. So what we want to do in this paper is, in a broad sense, just kind of look at this question of whether policy decisions can have an effect on the location of population later on. Okay? And from this specific example, we are going to also look at whether this specific policy intervention of rural social housing had an effect on Ireland's population in the 20th century. And to give away the ending, we do find an effect of these cottages, this rural social housing scheme on population in Ireland in the later 20th century. This is probably the first paper, hopefully from a larger set of papers that will follow on this project that will look at different outcomes. Okay, so this one focuses on population, but we also have a mind to look at the effect of this policy on health outcomes in Ireland in terms of public health and disease, and also politics and how these cottages and the provision of these cottages related to whether they had a political impact in Ireland in the 20th century. So I'm going to just show you on each of these sort of content slides some pictures of these cottages so you get a sense of what they look like. This is an example of one of these cottages in County Cork. These are as they're seen today or recently in recent years. So each time you'll see different examples. So these are quite recognizable in Ireland. When you go around the countryside, you can see them quite easily and pick them out, and many of them are still around with us today. So why do we care about this question of policy and housing policy and population? Well, mainly we care about it because of this issue of rural and rural to urban migration. And as population increases, we're about at peak rural population, and most of the rest of the population increase that's projected is going to be in the urban population. And a lot of this is going to be driven by rural to urban migration. Okay, and this is particularly relevant for developing countries. And it's raised a lot of questions about how sustainable this rural to urban migration patterns can be. Okay, and many countries have actually enacted policies to try and affect this rural urban migration. And the question really remains about how effective these policies are. Can you actually defy the sort of path dependence, defy economic geography, and influence the location of population within a country? From an Irish perspective, what was one of the things that sort of made us think about this project in the first place was the fact that Ireland is actually relatively under-urbanized by other standards, and only 63% of its population is urban. So compared to other countries of a relative or of a similar income level, Ireland is actually still relatively rural. Okay, and we want to think maybe this sort of piqued our interest into what effect maybe these cottages might have played in affecting the distribution of population in Ireland. So the elephant in the room when we talk about population in Ireland in the 19th and 20th centuries is a picture like this, where Ireland's population has yet to recover from the shock of the Great Famine in the 1840s and the subsequent decades of emigration that occurred afterwards. Okay, so most countries' population is much higher today than it was in the mid-19th century. Ireland is an unusual case in that it's actually not yet recovered to its 1840s population. If you take England and Wales population in 1841, it is now something like 3 times as big as it was then. So Ireland is a strange case in terms of population, but it makes it an interesting case to study also. what we want to talk about specifically are these Labourers Acts. Okay, and this is the series of acts that were passed by the Westminster government, as Ireland was part of the UK at the time, to provide for social housing in rural areas. Okay, and we have looked around, we can't find anything comparable that was attempted in before then. Okay, it was certainly not on the scale of this program. So we think it was the first large-scale social housing program. And what it did was it allowed local authorities, local governments, districts to borrow to fund the building of houses for eligible people. And these were exclusively at the beginning for agricultural labourers. But the definition of agricultural labourers changed as the late 19th century turned into the 20th century, and it became much more broad in its interpretation of who could qualify for and apply for one of these cottages. And uniquely for this sort of thing, most of this was exclusively for rural areas. Most of the attention is on housing in the early 20th century. It tends to be on urban slums and the later slum clearances that happened in the later 20th century. But Ireland is a special case in that the first and biggest program was aimed at rural areas. We don't have enough time to get into these sort of the drivers of this policy, but really all you need to know is this was really politically driven and not driven by necessity. If anything, policy should have focused on urban areas and on clearing the atrocious slums that were in Dublin and other cities. But for political reasons, this act occurred when it did and where it did in terms of affecting rural areas. But really, this was a politically driven thing and not based on necessity. What it did was allow you to build cottages, small cottages, one story, 2 to 3 bedroom, in often in clusters, but sometimes on their own. There was a very small variety in terms of the number of designs that were available. But they also included a patch of land that could be used to grow vegetables for the family, and really was supposed to provide some sort of self-sufficiency for these agricultural labourers. Came in 2 main phases. The first in the 1880s to the 1906 period. This is when the cottages had to be funded out of local taxation, which meant that basically the ratepayers, the local taxation payers, had to subsidise building of cottages, and this meant that the uptake was relatively low. What followed in the second phase was much more generous lending terms in terms of much lower interest rates and longer periods of repayment. And more importantly, perhaps, was that the cost was now, or a significant portion of the cost was now borne by a direct subsidy from the Westminster government. Okay, so this resulted in about 50,000 cottages being built across Ireland by about 1915. Okay, and this would have probably housed some maybe 10% of the rural population at the time. So it's a relatively big intervention, and we think that's why it may have had an effect in Ireland. It's just a map of Ireland showing the districts that we're talking about, give you a sense of what areas we're talking about, and also the concentration of these cottages in different parts of the country. So you can see that they're not evenly distributed across the country. They were more cottages built in the south and the east of the country, and fewer cottages built in the north and the west for a number of different reasons, which we go into the paper, but don't really have time to get into in this case. So this is what the data that we digitized looks like. Okay, these are the returns that were made to the House of Commons through the local government reports, and it shows the very detailed information on the cottages that were built and the amount of monies involved for their provision, the amount of lending. There was lots and lots of detail collected for each of these schemes in each of these different local government areas. We use these data, we combine them with population data from censuses from 1841 to 2002, and also look at initial conditions from the 1911 census. We get more information about housing, about religion, valuation, etc. from this census. And also combine this with agricultural data on land use and tenancy from agricultural statistics at the time. So what we do, we run a series of regressions. Mainly they take the form of having our population as a left-hand side variable, and we have our variable of interest, our cottages per capita, or we use a number of different approaches to scale the number of cottages, whether it's by the housing stock in 1911 or by area. And our results are relatively similar when we do. It doesn't depend on the scaling that we use. We try different ones. But we also look at various measures to do with location, such as distance to major cities, to other urban areas, and latitude and longitude, as well as other controls, as I said, from the 1911 census and from the agricultural statistics. But we use these variables here as our sort of baseline model before we apply other controls. So, 5 minutes? Okay. So this is a sort of picture we want to start with. You may be concerned that there may be pre-trends in our data, that we are maybe cottages were built in areas that had that were already growing in terms of population. So we explicitly test for those pre-trends using an advanced study analysis. If we look at the blue line here, this shows the effect of the cottages, or the impact of cottages on population by census year, going all the way through from 1841 to 2002. And you can see that before 1911, there is no evidence that these cottages were having an impact on population. But in the 20th century, we do see this positive effect of these cottages over time, and actually increasing over time. The green line here is explicitly controlling for this pre-trend that is there by using a linear pre-trend, and you can see that actually our results are not any lower. In fact, they may be even slightly higher, larger effects from including a pre-trend here because of the slight negative slope to that pre-trend period. In fact, that the cottages may even have been built in areas that were actually seeing declining population. So what we do next is to focus in on the period between 1911 and 2002, and just look at the change in population in this period and the effect of cottages on this population change. And really all you need to look at here is the various different specifications that have various different controls, but our estimate remains relatively stable and significant over time, over these different specifications. Okay, I'll just go quickly through what else we do. Of course, we're keen to try and establish a causal interpretation of this effect, but there are possibilities for endogeneity, obviously, particularly around emitted variables. Okay, so we want to try and run a series of tests to try and uncover whether this is a causal relationship. The first thing we do is to run a placebo test where we use the cottages that weren't built. Okay, so the First World War happens in 1914 and basically brings the building of cottages to a halt very abruptly because of increases in costs of building and general wartime retrenchment. And we use the cottages that were authorized but were never built as a sort of placebo to see whether these had an effect on future population. And we find that they don't. Which reinforces our sort of causal interpretation. We also take an IV approach where we use a change in the legislation that occurred in 1906 that put a cap on legal costs. And we see this as being associated with the building of more cottages or places that were affected by this legal cap built more cottages. And this is supporting our main results also. We also control for spatial correlation as well. So we see this as a causal story, or at least we think we've convinced ourselves that this is something that is really actually happening here. So we want to think more about the mechanism. What could be actually driving this? We see this as a story of these cottages keeping people rooted to the soil. Okay, and this quote comes from one of the politicians who was involved in the implementation and the design of this legislation that produced these labourers' acts. Okay, so he saw this as a policy to keep people rooted to the soil, to keep the population from declining, to counter the emigration that was occurring in 19th to 20th century Ireland. Okay, and this is really, we see this as changing the opportunity costs once you decide to lower the rents. Okay, these were very, very low rents, maybe 10% of the income of an agricultural labour was devoted to paying for the rents. And then a process of pen and purchase that reinforced this later on. I'll talk, if I have time, on that for 1 minute. So this is really where we see it. And it was targeted at the people who were most likely to migrate, the labourers in 19th century and 20th century Ireland. Okay, so the tenant purchase part was the bit that followed later, okay, where these cottages in the Republic of Ireland were allowed to be bought by their occupiers. Okay, so this converted these tenants into owner-occupiers from the 1930s at very discounted rates. Okay, the rents the repayments for these were well below the rents that they'd previously been paying. And the result was that most of these cottages became owner-occupied by the mid-1960s. But not in the north of Ireland, which became separate states in 1922. Okay, and we exploit this border change as a natural experiment. And we find that this supports this idea that this tenant purchase was an important part of the mechanism driving this relationship. Okay, so I've shown you some of the results, so I won't go into it anymore. I've showed you that we think this is a causal effect, and we've given you some evidence of a mechanism. At least we have some sort of an idea about what might be going on. Why was this policy effective? Well, we think it was really because it was so large in terms of its scope, and it affected every district in rural Ireland. It was generous in terms of its provisions. It was heavily subsidised, and it was targeted at the people that were most likely to migrate. So we think this is sort of all reasons to believe that this policy was effective. Again, as I said, we've more to do, but I'll leave it at that at this point. Hopefully I'm not too far over time.
So Cormac, go ahead and share the screen.
I'll try.
Okay.
Is it doing it? No.
Not yet.
Is that good?
Not yet, no.
No. Okay. Oh, here we go. Yes, there we go.
Okay, except now it's not allowing me. It is. Okay.
Okay, so you're able to move it around?
I have to go back. There we are. Yeah, good. Okay, so thanks a lot. I like the paper a lot. It's clever. It's carefully done. It's involved a lot of work. It's not a flashy paper based on one source. There's a lot of work involved in this. And the other thing to say about it is that not enough work in Irish economic history is of this kind. So there's something fresh, and there are these facts that we all know vaguely about, but they're presented in a very, very challenging way here. So it's a striking story, and this is one rendition. This is from William O'Brien, a politician who, was not a bit player in this story. He was a pro-Labour, pro-cottage member of Parliament, and he says that one sequel of the land settlement is the abolition. Less wonder working than the abolition of landlordism itself has been the establishment of an entire rural labouring class in cosy cottage allotments of 1 acre apiece. So it is a big story. It's important. And then we have the claim in this paper for striking long-term consequences as well. It's not just that a lot of people benefited at the time, but there are ramifications in the long run. There's, if you like, persistence. So what kind of cottages did people live in before? Well, this gives you some sense. These would be what would be called third class or fourth class cottages in Ireland. Some of these are surviving, and of course they always look better when the sun is out than when it's pouring rain. And then what the Labourers Act come up with or propose is more like this. So I suppose one thing I would say here is that these cottages I'm showing seem to be smaller than some of the ones Alan showed, and I'm just wondering, is there a survivor effect here that the ones that dot the landscape today are the more presentable, or ones that have been added to, or ones that were bigger to begin with. One commentator at the time, Guston Birrell, who was Chief Secretary in Ireland in the earlier part of the last century, described these cottages as ugly as the old cabins were romantic and rheumatic. So, you know, these here were, you know, they were damp and they were unhealthy. So the context is usually seen as the Irish Land War, which is the revolution of the tenantry against landlords and the replacement of a landlord-tenant system by a peasant proprietorship, and getting some of the gains associated with that switch across to labourers. And then there's also this other element of killing home rule with kindness, the sense that conservative politicians who were opposed to Irish independence thought they could sway people away from nationalism by being generous to them and providing a kind of an early welfare state. And like as Alan says, this was indeed a fairly ambitious undertaking. Now, it maybe should be pointed out that at the outset, the inspiration was different, because there was this Artisans and Labourers Dwellings Act in Britain itself, which then was extended to Ireland, but only to urban areas. And the idea then was to extend the Artisan Dwelling Act and what that did for urban authorities to rural sanitary authorities. And the poor law guardians were deputed to operate the system at the beginning. So even though we think of this as part of killing home rule with kindness and the national struggle by the peasantry and the labourers, the origins, to be pedantic about it, were different. Now, this is what Ireland was like before these acts. If I can get rid of that. So in terms of housing categories, first-class housing, this is living in great comfort, and then you have second, third, and fourth. So fourth-class housing, this is essentially one-room mud cabins without windows, or no glass windows. They are a kind of already a bit of a residual by the time the Labourers Act come around. But you have a lot of third-class accommodation, which isn't that much better. And the incidence varies by province. It's a bit of an oversimplification, sometimes misleading, to divide Ireland into these four provinces, but we all do it. And you'll see that Connacht has more bad housing than Leinster. About half of the housing in Leinster is very inferior. In Connacht, it's over 2/3. And then if you want to look at extremes, Mayo has 81%, and in Meath, it's 62%. Yeah, so, and Alan already showed this map, which is a great map. And these are the provinces. One thing that I would draw attention to is that there are still, in 1911, a few pockets where there are no cottages whatsoever built. And I'm pointing here to Northwest Donegal, Northwest Mayo. These are desperately poor areas. Also around Cahersiveen and the Iveragh Peninsula in Kerry. And if you look at the what these different shades represent, you will see that the province of Connacht still in 1911 has very, very little cottages. And the same is true to a lesser extent of the province of Ulster. So the bulk of the cottages are in this area here, which is in North Leinster, and then in counties Limerick and Cork, and to a lesser extent Tipperary, in Munster, and then South Leinster a bit too. But there is this strong regional pattern, And broadly, what it represents is that the poorest areas to begin with got fewest cottages. And you would have thought, well, maybe it should have been the other way around. But that's what the data tell us. And then there is also a lot of resistance to the cottages in Ulster. And that is because maybe greater landlord influence in Ulster. They were not interested in having these cottages built. Elsewhere in Ireland, there was a good deal of resistance by farmers as well. So, like, I would highlight this point here, very, very few in Connacht. And that is shown here again in this map here, which unfortunately is not that clear, and it was never printed. It was printed for the government, so it's available in an archival source. It's not out there in public. But you have here the districts, and you'll see, if you look down here in this area here where it's white, and this is the story up to 1895, practically the whole of Connacht has nothing. And then you have here in this area here in Dromore and Sligo, 10 cottages built by 1895. Down here in Dingle, 10 cottages built, whereas in Kilmallock here in Limerick, you have 743. And then there are these areas in black where nothing had been done and where the government is very annoyed and is taking proceeding against the sanitary authorities in those places for not doing anything. Again, you see here in large tranches of Ulster here, no cottages being built. So the impact of the Act for most of the period we're talking about is partial. And again, this tells you percentages of cottages built by 94, 1906 and 1916. In Connacht, only 7.7% of all the cottages are in Connacht. By 1916, it's only 5% of the total. So each of these columns adds to 100. And true, Connacht is smaller, so you would expect fewer cottages. And it's also truer that there are fewer labourers in cottages. So this gives you the ratio of farmers to labourers. There are twice as many in Munster and Leinster, where the farms are bigger, so that there's more work for labourers. But the proportion of cottages built per 1,000 population to 1890 is a big multiple in Munster and Leinster, and the greater ratio of labourers to farmers doesn't explain that, nor does the fact that the population of Connacht is smaller. So Connacht and much of Ulster are under-cottaged, if you like. And I think here, and I know Ronan and Alan will go into this in more detail as they proceed, but I think one should pay attention to what historians have to say about the authorities who were responsible for allowing these cottages to be built. And you have, for example, a local historian, Jim O'Shea, a very good one, who's written a book about Tipperary, and he says that clerical pressure had a lot to do with it, political influence, and also labour militancy late in the period. Jim Donnelly, now retired, ex-Madison, who says, unless under pressure, with the notable exception of their frequent attempts to harass landlords by selecting sites on dwellings for evicted farms, the farmers themselves were, to put it mildly, not proactive. And then there is a good extended discussion of all of this by Virginia Crossman. And she says that sometimes people try to push the farmers into building cottages just to annoy them. And she gives the rather witty example of a group who want to get cottages built on an evicted farm and let them to women of a low reputation.
Cormac, I'm not sure if you can hear Price, but he was just saying that you're heading close to time.
Okay, okay, and I couldn't hear him. And then there's more of that. So, and then you have Joe Lee, who talks about the local government board and the new three Fs, where family, friends, and favors had a lot to do with where these cottages were built. So the questions, and I know I'm running out of time, so I'll be very quick. The one thing I would maybe push is that the cottages are less likely to be built where they were needed most, in the poorest areas. And of course, that would mean also that they were more likely to be ignored in those areas where population was doomed to decline anyway. Okay, so that is an issue. And then there is also something, mightn't you expect the impact on population change to diminish over time? This is something that maybe would take a little bit more work. So this is the last slide. The paper is very careful, and on the estimation, I have really no problems. But I think the history is still a bit patchy. Despite the acts, the number of labourers is down from 350,000 at the start of the land war to 160,000 a half year. So at the period these cottages are being built, there is the hemorrhaging of rural labourers. I would also see micro examples of the mechanism at work. You know, is there some evidence that these cottages themselves were the mechanism for the population growth, or is it some other mechanism? And that would, of course, raise the issue, what proportion of the cottages survive and who lives in them and so on. So I would be inclined to look very hard for other reasons, if only to dismiss them, because you know, the estimation is good, the placebo test, the kind of discontinuity analysis, all that stuff is good. But we still might be, as historians, need more conviction on the historical side. Final thing is, on spatial autocorrelation, Morgan Kelly now has a new test, and I would put the estimation through that hopper as well. But to end with, I love the paper, and I'm looking forward to seeing the next versions and commenting on those too. Thanks a lot.
So release the screen. Cormac, I tried to stop you for 6 minutes over. Did you hear me then?
I can't hear you.
Oh, okay. Release the screen.
I stopped, okay?
Okay, so you're over. Okay, so we're out of time for this paper. So as you can probably well tell. Okay, so our next speaker, David or John, who was going to do it? Okay, so John Brown to present. Cormac's good to see you. And
good.
Okay, so. Okay, so John, you just need to find my. Okay, you need to find it. My bad. It's here. Okay, should be good. So at least I can stand next to you.
Yeah. We can't get started. Oh, we should be sharing, right? Oh, we're not. Yeah. Good. Okay, good. Great. I will be brief, as they say. My colleague David Cuberes is also here with me. So this is our joint project we've been working on for a couple of years. And we're interested in a number of questions we'll get to. The title is Birth and Persistence of Cities. And we're looking at the state of Oklahoma. So I'll give a brief intro about maybe the salience of this issue for getting some sense of why we're interested in Oklahoma and why we're interested in what the issues are, the bigger issues, particularly for urban economics and urban economic history. A few tidbits of Oklahoma history, brief description of our data, a few results taken from the large smorgasbord we offer in the paper, and then a brief mention on a conclusion. So fundamental is really to urban economics, and I think as someone whose other area aside from history was urban economics, fundamental issues for urban economics are really what is accounting for city growth and also city creation, and I should say also city death. So we're interested in the field really creates two different perspectives. One is a focus on what's known as first nature, and that's geography and fixed features of a location. In our interpretation, we're actually expanding geography and fixed features to really both human as well as physical geography. Second nature is something that is really kind of more exciting part of urban economics. What are the benefits of co-location of people and firms? So all sorts of potential agglomeration economies that may actually then lead to benefits that could override the natural advantages of the location. I think of all the textile towns in New England, for example. Yes, they did have water power, but at some point it was really the agglomeration benefits that really made them very successful places for many years. Our paper examines then the influence of both first and second nature on the process of, I'll say, village, town, city, place formation in Oklahoma from over the entire century, from the initial period of white settlement in 1889, or I should say non-native settlement, through 1990. And we really have identified three periods of interest. First is a period of initial settlement by non-native people, and that's the famous land rush of 1889. Then that's where we can explore questions of first nature more fundamentally, because we have no prior settlement in those unassigned lands. Secondly is then an oil boom known by historians as a black gold era. This very particular oil boom that hit Oklahoma from 1900 roughly to the mid-1920s. We'll talk a little bit about both, but really what brought that to an end, because that actually plays an important part in terms of our thinking about the timing in our paper. Finally, then there's a post-oil shock period running all the way through 1990. We want to find out to what extent did the urbanization experience during the Black Gold era actually have a long-term persistent effect, which actually point us more than to benefits that may have accrued to urban growth that came from actually second nature forces, creation of an agglomeration that then had a long-lasting benefits. We use geography and time variation to identify plausibly causal impacts. A couple of contributions I'll highlight. First of all, Oklahoma's urban history is really quite unique to the United States. I'll say just unique to the United States. First of all, a period of rapid settlement is not replicated in any other state. Really, the state fills up very quickly in a very short period of time. And I think having read the opus magnus on the ghost towns of Oklahoma, I'm also familiar with the fact that there's a tremendous amount of churning in the urban system that takes place in this state that we don't have examples from other states, but because of the uncertainty over what the potential is for Oklahoma, and I think it's fairly complicated past. There's a lot of churning, a lot of growth, but also death of places and cities and so forth. We draw on the history then we want to develop what we believe is a clean estimate of the importance of first nature. I'll say already it's smallish, but not zero. Then we implement a model that links the productivity shocks to predictions about the patterns of urban growth. And that then leads us then to think about what happens when you have a productivity shock that is causal and precisely targeted. And so we can think both the models suggest that there's going to be a transitional path, a short-run impact on growth that in these boom towns from the Black Gold era turns out to be quite immense. And then secondly, we want to provide a link to thinking about the resource curse literature with the estimates of long-run impacts of this oil boom on urban formation. So I think the key implication, a bottom line from the longer-term examination of our results is really that there's a substantially enhanced role for second nature in understanding current patterns of urbanization in Oklahoma. Okay, we have two Oklahoma history highlights we'd like to point out. First of all, there's the very famous land run of 1889 that I think anybody in our room or online would be clear about. There's this rose or colored section in the middle that is actually for various treaty reasons left empty, despite the fact it's then surrounded by a whole number of other Indian administered and Indian territories. Oklahoma is the last place where roughly 40, 45 different tribes, American tribes, are packed in over time. The initial settlers are those who are in the 1907 area. Those are the known as the civilized, quote-unquote civilized tribes coming from the south and southeast, and the remainder then are brought in from other parts of the United States to settle. The map basically shows the periods of time over which then non-native settlers are granted access to these lands through then 1907, which is then the date of statehood, and that's when the tribal governance in the civilized tribes areas is extinguished, and Oklahoma becomes then a state. So the land run of 1889 takes place very, very fast. There is new town formation, though some of those places survive, some of those don't. And we're asking two questions. What was the impact of the first nature on the spatial pattern of urbanization? We want to find out, and we try to then specify first nature, which we'll see shortly in terms of our data. And the second, you want to know, once we've actually seen an urban system emerge in this initial area of settlement, unassigned lands, we want to find out how much did the persistence account for the subsequent pattern that we observed by 1900. The second quasi-natural experiment is really what we call the black gold oil boom of the 1900 to 1920s. This really gets underway, as you can see in the graph here, during the period between 1910 and 1920. And despite the fact we have a decrease, the vertical axis is the number of new pools or fields of oil discovered, we still get a tremendous increase in production. So even in the early 1920s, Oklahoma is number one and number two among the oil producers in the USA. A peculiar feature of this black gold period is the geology. The fields that are discovered are relatively inexpensive to exploit, and those are called flush oil fields. You don't really need it. Basically, the oil just comes up out of the ground once you've actually drilled your well and you've found oil. And secondly, this is under a system of quite free entry into oil exploration and then discovery. So the typical pattern is there's a new discovery well finds oil, and then there's a rush to secure leases or to take advantage of leases that have already been secured in the area. Everybody puts their straw into the pool, they draw out the oil, and typically in a period of 10 years, most of the oil is gone. So it's a very short period of extraction typically. I mean, there's further extraction, but the big amount of extraction takes place very short period of time. That then leads to a really traumatic pattern of boom-bust urbanization that takes place across a number of towns in the parts of Oklahoma affected by the oil boom. So the other point we make, the time incidence of the shock differs across the state. And finally, then this boom comes to an end, both because of the exhaustion of the flush oil fields, so the geology no longer for what's left. You don't really have these kinds of fields available. And secondly, because Oklahoma oil has contributed so much to U.S. production and depressed prices, we have a whole new system that is reinforced during the New Deal legislation of proration and other limits on production that really sever the link between oil discoveries and boom towns. So our research strategy really followed a couple of different steps. Model development, we tried to get a sense of what the impact of productivity shock is on urban growth in the short run and long run implications. We're drawing upon David's earlier theoretical work, data and estimation strategy. A few comments on data and then a few comments on our conclusions. Geography, we developed, we had to create a geography that was actually of a much smaller higher spatial resolution than counties. And so we're using townships, which are a much smaller geography, several townships within the context of a county, many places up to 300, 350. Then we're focused on either population density for our townships or population for places. Then the first nature we really identify is really human first nature, transport of various kinds, whether trails or railroads, and then a prior settlement prior to 1889. Physical nature is very standard measures of rivers, ruggedness, and potential agricultural productivity. We do include time-varying data on moisture and terms of trade for the period of the short-term period, and we look at geo-referenced information on erosion. Yes. So productivity shocks is this map. Geo-reference all the oil discoveries between 1900 and 1940, and then we actually interpolate them using IDW to get a sense of which areas are actually influenced. You can see the very, very small squares on that. Those are our townships. We actually get a relatively high degree of spatial resolution. So a couple comments then on the results. First nature versus second nature, we discovered that really first nature influences about 1/4 of the variation in population density, both in 1890 and 1900. Most of this is actually railroad depots and a little bit also closeness to trails and so forth and prior places as we extend our analysis. Secondly, we then discover once we get to 1900, there's a lot of little places that are established in Oklahoma, and we discover pretty quickly that it's mostly second nature, prior population that's driving population density in our townships by 1900. So overall then, even if I'm looking at 1900 when Oklahoma is still overwhelmingly a rural state, 2/3 of variation in population density in our townships is actually from prior population in a township. And after 1900, first nature really accounts for a 30-40% range in terms of accounting directly for township population density. But if I actually looking at place data, which is what's reported in the census, we actually find that falls to only 7 to 9%. That suggests to me we want to be more sensitive in thinking about how we're defining places as we look at urban economic history. The short run and long run analysis of oil discoveries then focuses on the impact in the short run of productivity on urban productivity. And we find that basically the model suggests this can be stronger in denser locations, is going to be persistent, even if the shock is short-lived. Summary of the productivity results, we have a couple key outcomes. First of all, there's a continued very strong role for persistence in accounting for population density and population across our two different geographies. The elasticity of population density with respect to the median oil shock is really quite consistent across places as well as our townships, and it's on the order of 0.28 to 0.45. This is a very, very big elasticity if you look at other kinds of influences on productivity in other studies in urban economics. And we find then that this elasticity then falls to only 0.04 during that last decade in our analysis, basically after the end of the black gold era. So that really consistently, it suggests then that if I'm looking at oil's impact on urbanization, it's really during this first period, the black gold era, not later on as the oil industry matures and develops other forms of exploitation. We discover that the interaction between initial population and then a discovery actually is important in the 1910 to 1919 period of discovery. That is census year 1920. We have two different measures of oil, and they both matter in terms of accounting for the township and population. We didn't include these in the paper we submitted to Hoyt, but we displaced our shocks randomly 25 to 50 kilometers east or west, and we really found then that there is no impact of the shock on the township or town or place population. Okay, long run impacts of the productivity shocks. It turns out that the shocks during black gold were intense, but a very short duration. But even as we look in 1940 going forward to 50, 1960, even 1990, we actually see a continued impact of the oil shock on population, even though oil extraction either has been eliminated or is actually substantially reduced. And even when we control for the amount of oil extraction in a county for those areas we can. So our estimation then is really gives us this security. This table is impossible to read, and I only have 11 seconds left. So the main point will be that we have very positive effects of oil shocks on population density through 1990, and the stability all the way through 1960. So a shock that took place in 1915 lives on to 1960, even though overall township population is declining pretty rapidly even through 1960. And many of these places have experienced overall in Oklahoma declines in population. So we'll look forward to comments from Hoyt and also audience participants. Thank you. Yes, I'll stop my share.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I think they're here. I can't see. All right, let's just assume it's that. Yes. All right.
Okay. And then
Okay,
sure.
Okay, I'll let you do it since you've done that before. Well, wow. I haven't been sure.
Here you go.
Okay, hello, I'm Hoyt Bleakley. It was a pleasure to read this paper and look forward to seeing more of the output from this project. It's a very interesting study, as was said, of Oklahoma's land opening. We saw this map. We're talking about the pink area, right, where there's a rush that comes into the middle. There's pretty good data here because thanks to the public land survey system, we can keep track of a lot of where these places are in a fairly consistent manner. Now, if I had written this paper, of course, I would have made a reference to Rogers and Hammerstein, and I think I would have called it Oklahoma, where the wind comes sweeping down the featureless plain. But the point is, there is no featureless plain anywhere. The mountain behind us obviously looks pretty dramatic, and there's nothing like that in this area. But there are enough features that it makes sense. But their argument is this is nevertheless interesting because, we have sort of this tabula rasa of location, at least in vis-a-vis white settlement or non-native settlement, let's say. That itself is not quite true, but in any event, there is this kind of funny claim that the paper starts with that the bone that I would pick with it is saying, there's limited evidence that the colonization of the Americas or America was influenced by these first nature forces, which I couldn't understand what you're thinking of in terms of evidence. For example, do they have some view that like the 13 colonies, there's just no reason why they were on the Atlantic Ocean, right? That they could have been in the middle of the country, right? So I think by evidence they mean people ran regressions. Maybe I think we have a pretty good sense of the first nature advantages that determine why the Chesapeake Bay was settled before the Sacramento or the San Francisco. Jefferson, in fact, has this nice an early observation on urban systems where he talks about the Chesapeake Bay. He says that our country is so intersected with navigable waters and the trade just comes to us. So that instead of being obliged to go in quest of it, this is probably one of the causes why we don't have any towns of consequence. So, there's some early thinking, early evidence on first nature advantages determining not just where the cities are, but in this case, where the cities aren't, or just that there aren't that many. Another example there that I'll skip. Anyway, I won't go full, I don't want to replicate the Fishback McCloskey incident of yesterday, so I won't criticize that any further. But there's a lot interesting in here in terms of the locational fundamentals, sort of the timing of fundamentals. I put some of these things in quotes. I guess if I were a historian, I'd say so-called exogenous features, but I'm not nearly that intellectual, so I'll put them in quotes. There are these features that happen at the beginning when the settlement happens, when the cannon goes off and the people start running, or when they're supposed to start running, and then the oil boom. Now, some of these things that are exogenous are, of course, not really exogenous, like the railroad that went through where some of the early towns were. Maybe we need a little bit of care in the language. I think I'd be in trouble with Paul Rohde if I let you use a suitability index uncommented because, those are based on contemporary things, not contemporary notions of which crops grow where, which could be wrong here. And those indices in general have some really terrible features like, that predict there should be a cotton belt in Iowa, which seems kind of absurd. But in any event, I'm happy to go with a lot of these because they do seem predictive and interesting and they kind of work the way they should. I think the more interesting part of this paper is not that, because the understanding kind of the direction of settlement to these places that are advantageous is, I think, understood, if not the subject of 4 million regressions. I think this particular episode, as it works with the temporary oil booms, is quite interesting. And roughly speaking, they're looking at this oil boom that happens, and after a while, it doesn't look like it has sort of additional marginal impact on the population. That is to say that once you start controlling for what lagged population was, the presence of oil doesn't make any difference. And I think the narrative there is that the thing goes away, right? That there's no more oil coming out of the ground. Maybe there's no scope for oil coming out of the ground. They actually have some control strategies for fixing that up. So it's not like we necessarily can go find more oil, but instead it's that, there's some stickiness to the population there, such that the impact persists. Now, one test I'd recommend is I'd actually want to look at, say, the employment patterns in these places, right? These places where there was an oil boom, does at some point, do they look like everywhere else in terms of their employment of whoever works in the oil industry and whoever in the linkages to the oil industry? So that seems like, in order to seal that case, I'd want to see, some additional evidence of that in that regard. There's the map that John showed. These are where the places are. An interesting result that comes out, and John showed this table, I guess I'll show it again, is the interaction of features, right? Which is to say that it looks like there is, here's as I mentioned, the lag population variable. Here's this interesting interaction result. This appears in several tables, but this is one example where here's the shock. And does it have an effect everywhere on a lag basis? Does it have this persistence everywhere? It turns out that persistence is mainly concentrated in places that were settled, right? And so is this an issue that some land is so bad that you would never put a city there, and so there's never going to be this persistence? That would be one story. The other story would be a more human-derived story, which is to say, you go there, you go there, and there are things that you need to do that kind of are related to the oil industry that are easier to set up quickly. Remember, these are just temporary shocks. So let me back up a little bit. What's a temporary shock look like? Well, think about the fracking boom in North Dakota, right? So there's this temporary shock. There's a bunch of people who kind of show up, live in trailers, and other associated activities that they do are all kind of done on a very temporary basis. And when the boom ends, a lot of the folks go home. Now, what would influence whether that, let's call that a locational investment, but it's a temporary one. What are the things that would influence whether that's a temporary or a longer live locational investment? Well, it might depend on a couple of things. One is it easier to make a slightly longer term investment in a place where there's already population? So for example, if your service that you're providing is small scale, maybe you're more likely to do so where there's a town site where the land's already parceled out, et cetera. You're maybe not going to buy a greenfield 160 acres and use your 1 acre to do whatever it is that services the oil industry. So that would be kind of the human derived version of this that bears some thinking about. The other thing that's relevant are substitutes, right? So I think what's missing a little bit, maybe a little bit, what's mainly missing in this paper is some attention to that these aren't all islands or planets, exoplanets that are separate from each other, but they're all next to each other. And so I think needs a little bit more thinking about if this is a service that gets kind of associated with the oil boom, but that it stays, is it more likely that that's going to happen in a place where there's a city, but it was really providing that service to the whole region or some such thing. And so you get this persistent effect that happens that was sort of the effect, not of what happens right there, but that everybody's having the oil boom. And so you can certainly imagine that substitutes are really important across space. Luke Hain likes to tell the story of the wagon road and the Erie Canal, that they mostly have the same path. And so when they have the same path, there's these cities that were there on the wagon road and they persist when the canal comes through. And they're the ones where the wagon road's not in the same place and the wagon, those places shrink, right? So it's about something else forms to substitute away from that. Recently, I've had occasion to, there's another Broadway music reference, to go to the room where this happened. This is Appomattox Courthouse. There's another interesting kind of substitution story there. That's in Mr. McLean's house there in his parlor. That's the chimney that's associated with the fireplace. There's a surrender there. This is the extremely well preserved Appomattox Courthouse. You might say, how could they preserve this place that's a county seat? And the answer is it's not the county seat anymore. Why is it not the county seat anymore? So there's the national park where it is. And I'll zoom in here. There's where Appomattox is now. That's where like the courthouse and all these things. Why did that happen? Well, the railroad, when it came through, basically went this way, right? It didn't bother stopping here. Didn't even come close. And so all the activity kind of shows up here. For a long time, the county said, we're going to keep the courthouse here, we're going to keep the courthouse there. Finally, they just gave up, right? So they kind of moved to the new place. So the availability of substitutes was relevant. I could talk for 10 more minutes about the land lottery of Oklahoma, except to say that there are other interesting effects where they put the town site in the usual places they go with the PLSS grid. And that people want to go there, right? When they get these random parcels, they're free to choose where they go line up around where the town sites are. So there's certainly a relevance there where you glom onto where you think the activity is going to be. Very interesting paper. I guess my closing thing is there's a lot here. There's almost too much here. I'd consider whether there are pieces of this that would become different projects. So just looking at the oil boom itself might be interesting. Just looking about the persistence of different types of initial advantages might be a thing. Maybe just looking at the interaction would be a thing if you consider, what is really going on underneath. And look at that. 1 second. Look at that. I didn't.
Does anybody online want to comment? Does anybody online want to comment? First question. Okay, well, let's move on to the next paper. So our next paper is by Ed Hechter, and he's going to talk about transportation technology, and then Dan Bogart's going to be his discussant. So let's release our screen. Okay, Eric,
yes.
You want to grab the screen?
Yeah, can I just check that you can hear me well before I do that?
We can hear you fine, no problem.
That's great. Then let me share my screen, and you should be able to see my slides now.
Yes, definitely.
Perfect. All right, thanks very much. I'm also going to start my timer, and I'll try to police myself.
Okay.
But do feel free to intervene if it looks like I might not make it.
No worries. Okay, can you see me when I'm standing here?
I can see you and hear you well, yeah.
Okay, so if I show you this sign, you'll be able to see it?
Yeah, I'll keep an eye on that. Thanks.
Okay, great.
Okay, let me begin by thanking the organizers and congratulating them for a great program and for including me on it. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this paper. Both Dan's discussion, he's already been very kind to send me a lot of very useful comments, but I look forward to his discussion and also to hear the thoughts during the Q&A in the room. So what I'll be telling you about today is my paper, which is entitled Transportation Technology, Individual Mobility and Social Mobilization. And to make that title a bit less nebulous, let me be more clear about exactly what I mean. So I'm going to be looking at late 19th, early 20th century Sweden, where the transportation shock that I'll be exploiting is the rollout of a truly national railway system. And I'll be looking at the impact that this new infrastructure gives individuals to travel and what the effects of that mobility is for mobilization in various grassroots social movements that became important for Sweden's subsequent democratization. But before I get into the specifics, let me begin with a slightly broader introduction and framing. So I think it's well established that grassroots social movements can be powerful forces for change along a variety of different dimensions, be they economic, social, or political. But what I think we know less about is what determines the success of these movements and what enables it to spread. So if we go back to a long tradition of theoretical work in economic sociology, for example, what becomes clear from reading that is that knowing what other people are doing in this potential mobilization network is key. I need to know that enough other people are going to undertake this costly social mobilization action for that to also encourage me to mobilize myself. But there is a literature that also says that communication need not necessarily or straightforwardly facilitate mobilization, going back, for example, to the work of Mansur Olsen on the free rider problem, but there are ways to make this more elaborate within a explicit network setting, where if I become aware of the more central individuals in a potential mobilization network, then I also become aware of the fact that other people are mobilizing, and this may induce me to reduce my effort in mobilizing. So all of this is to say that this is an empirical question, and so far the focus has been on relatively short-run bursts of more extreme forms of collective action that is manifested in protests, say. And here I want to highlight a very recent paper that's now, I believe, forthcoming in the AAR by Garcia Jimeno and co-authors on the Temperance Crusade in 19th century America. But so the specific research question I'm going to be asking and answering takes a longer temporal view, which says in order for these short-run bursts of collective action to materialize and be effective, there needs to be a latent support for these types of ideas. And the question I'm going to ask is how technology that facilitates social interactions between individuals in society, in my setting, by actually allowing them to physically move around and interact with a greater potential audience, how does that shape the spread of social movements? And what's the role of a spatial process of diffusion in this process? And I'm going to turn to Swedish history in the period of 1881 to 1910 as a natural testing ground for these types of questions, for two reasons. Firstly, because we see a large-scale expansion of the railway network, which became truly national in extent during this period, and this brought about large travel cost reductions, which really for the first time allowed people to travel widely within the country. And at the same time, we see the nascence and the rise of social movements, which became dominant well into the 20th century, beyond the Second World War. So these were temperance organizations pushing for US-style prohibition and almost succeeding, free churches that were religious organizations separate from the state church, as well as a range of, you can think of labor organizations, unions and leftist parties. So these are, of course, very different types of organizations, but a unifying theme or unifying objective of these organizations was to push for extensions to, at this time, the relatively narrow Swedish franchise. So in order to look at the relationship between these two developments, that is the expansion of the railway network and the rise of these movements, I'm going to use very nice data from this period in Sweden, which allows me to construct a yearly panel covering over 2,000 parishes each year for over 30 years. I'm going to be able to say which organizations among those that I just mentioned are present where and what are their membership numbers. Add to this my right-hand side variable, which will be how proximate are these parishes to the railway in every year. And I'll also be able to do some least cost path constructions, which I won't have too much time to talk about today, but it's in the paper and the richness of the data allows me to do that. I'll supplement this to get at mechanisms with station level data for a subset of these parishes of arrivals, both of passengers and freight. This will allow me to say that it's the mobility of individuals and not of goods that is driving the results I'm going to present to you. Empirically, I use a variety of different strategies. Given the short time frame of this presentation, I'll spend most of my time lounging quite comfortably in this first bullet point here, just showing you descriptively what seems to be going on in the data. But in the paper and hopefully a bit today, I'll be able to show you that the main relationships that come out of these correlations survive having fixed effects and controls thrown them in an OLS estimation. It survives using an instrument, using the proximity to initial railway plans for the national railway network to generate some kind of exogenous variation in proximity to actually constructed railway. And it survives an alternative empirical strategy, which takes more of an event study flavor, where I look at what happens before and after large reductions in distances to the railway, showing that things take off after these reductions, but don't seem to be going on differentially before. The main findings that I'll summarize and give you the main flavor of today is that parishes that become well connected via the railway are more likely to host any organization. That's an extensive margin result. Subsequently, these places see larger membership numbers and have a greater number of distinct organizations. By this last point, I mean not just that a union enters and runs the shop locally for the remainder of the period, but rather we see a greater diversity of different types of organizations, if you will. In sort of exploring the mechanisms behind this result, I find that it's driven by what I call social market access. That is a least cost path weighted average of membership in other parishes. The logic being that as the railway expands nearer my parish, I become better connected to already existing concentrations of membership in other parishes. And that seems to be driving quite strongly what happens to me in my parish. And using this station level data on flows of passengers and freight, I'll show that these social movement results are driven by flows of passengers and not of freight once a station opens locally. I do some exercises to rule out other explanations, of course, not saying that these explanations are not important in themselves in explaining the rise of social movements, but that these alternative explanations cannot explain away the mechanism I'm proposing. So these include demand-side explanations such as religious structure changing or occupational structure changing, as well as things like emigration possibilities or access to education. And on the supply side, I'll be able to control for the expansion of the telegraph system, as well as circulation of post through the postal service. And then finally, I'll show these things mattered because in 1911, which is the first election with universal male suffrage, places that had more social movement or higher social movement presence exhibit higher turnout and higher vote shares for the Social Democrats. So, if you will, the kind of roots of a kind of participatory political system where the Social Democrats kind of run the shop seem to have at least some roots in this earlier period of social mobilization in these movements. So to begin with some motivating observations, and as I promised, this is where I'll just sit for the majority of the talk. I know I have about 5.5 minutes left. So here I'll just show you the main patterns that come out in the data. But before showing you any pictures or graphs, I'm going to start with just quoting two of the most eminent historians on the two sides of my relationship of interest. So beginning with the social movement side, Lundqvist, who is one of the most eminent historians in Sweden of these movements, in his book from the 1970s, said that the channels of communication for these new ideas were primarily personal visits, be it by colporteurs who would go and set up reading groups, preachers who would sort of proselytize for their new free church movements, labor agitators, and others. And a key example of this is August Palm, who was one of the early social democrats who went on what he called agitation travels, where he would travel along the railway line, stopping at the towns along the way and speaking to laborers there. Approaching the problem from the other direction is Eli Hechter, who of course is better known for his work on trade theory, but he also has very nice work on Swedish economic history, and particularly that of the railways, where he writes that travel has been extended to infinitely wider strata of the population, and this gives rise to an apparent democratizing effect of travel in the present, which for him at the time of writing was 1907. So it seems that historians who have written about this from both sides, that is on the social movement side and on the railway side, seem to emphasize this importance of mobility of individuals. Now, how does the relationship between these two variables look in my data? So let me begin by showing you the extent of railway expansion in Sweden over my period of interest. So I begin in 1881, at which point this is not a blank slate. There is already some railway development that has taken place, but over the course of the 30-year period, we see this expanded quite dramatically, with thousands of kilometers of railway lines being built into the north of Sweden, but also the network in the south becoming much more dense. So there are both kind of extensive margin improvements, but also intensive margin improvements that even in the south, even though you may have had a railway connection, now that connection might be more direct to different places. On the social movement side, we see a similar rise. So here I'm plotting the information separately for all the four different movements, but let's focus on the temperance movements up here in the top left, and I'll walk you through how to interpret these graphs. So in the solid line, I'm plotting on the left-hand vertical axis the proportion of parishes which have at least one such movement present. And you can see for the temperance movements, this goes from basically zero in the early 1880s up to about 70% or so of parishes having one of these movements present. And at the same time, we see on the national level a large rise in the total membership that these movements enjoyed. So here I plot in thousands the number of members nationally in these temperance movements, which you see goes from, again, zero in the 1880s up to about 300,000 by the early 1900s. And if we were to add up all of the members in all of these movements by the early 1900s, that would yield a membership of about 700,000 compared to a population of Sweden at this time, which was no more than 5.5 million. That really is a social mobilization with quite a broad base. So now how do these two things correlate? So first, let me show you two maps to show you the spatial correlation between these two things at two snapshot years. So on the left, I'm showing you at the beginning of the sample period, the extent of the railway network, In red, the red dots being the parishes where these movements are present, the black smaller dots being where they are not yet present. And if we fast forward to 1890, we see that movements have in general spread, and it seems to be predominantly in places that are relatively well connected along the railway network. Here in the south, for example, the parishes that are in the rural parts of the south of Sweden, which are far from railway, have not yet seen the arrival of these movements. And if we throw all of these and pull all of these parish year observations together and look at the just raw correlation between them, here just residualizing with 25 very broad regional fixed effects, we see the negative relationship. That is, and here this is on a log scale, so going 1 unit to the right doubles the distance to the railway. You see this negative relationship that the further away you are from the railway, the lower in this graph is the probability that a temperance movement is present in your parish. And this holds true for all 4 movement types. So I know I have about 1 minute or so left. Let me summarize basically what I do in the paper to probe this relationship further and to make a causal claim about this relationship. The data I've already described, but I make a contribution essentially on the railway side by digitizing historical railway maps to get these yearly measures of how close parishes are to the constructed railway line. The social movements data are very nice, and the result of over 10 years of work by Andre Lundqvist. Here I cannot claim to contribute that, but I can contribute in the sense of using it in new ways. So the empirical strategy I'm going to use, and here I'll take just 1 minute to summarize what I do, is to estimate equations of the following form, where the social movement outcome in a given year in a given parish depends on fixed effects, controls, and this distance to the railway. And I construct an instrument using proximity to initial plans for the network to generate variation in this distance to the railway. This builds on the history of railway construction in Sweden, following on from insights by Tuberger and Kerstin Enfro. And what's nice is that these plans essentially targeted specific places for railway construction, not taking too much care about what was in between these targeted places. And I can show that this balances very nicely on pre-existing observables, that places in between important targeted places were not in between by in any sort of systematic way. We're not near this plan in any systematic way. So that validates the use of that of the plan in an instrument to generate exogenous variation in distance to the railway. And the results basically confirm what I showed you in the descriptive graphs, that the probability of movement presence is negatively related, both in the OLS and in the IV, to the distance to the nearest railway. The same for membership numbers and for the number of distinct organizations locally. I have a lot more results in the paper, but since I'm already a minute or so over time, let me conclude at this stage. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing Dan's discussion and any questions that I may hopefully answer. Thank you.
Good job.
Just ran over slightly, but that's okay.
No worries. No worries. You were good. Right. Okay. Okay. There you are. Oh, come on. Now what's going on? How come it won't come up? Is that Eric? Oh, here it is. Okay, here's what's going on. Okay. Oh. And then you're there. Okay.
Thank you, Price. All right, I will try to go quickly. So these are my comments on Eric's paper. Let me give you a quick summary of this is partly a railways paper in my mind, but it obviously goes to outcomes that are beyond economic. So quick summary of this literature. So there's a nice growing literature about railways being a force of development and spatial divergence. This is pretty well established now in different countries. In Sweden, the story fits. Being close to a railway led to more population and industrial occupations relative to being further away. Berger has a very nice paper showing this, giving you a good quantitative estimate. Railways also led to further structural changes, education, literacy, innovation, series of...
Dan, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I can't always hear you super well. So...
Stay in line. Okay. Can you hear me now, Eric?
I can hear you.
All right. I won't wander from it. Okay.
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
Great. So the key point here is that the impact of railways on politics, culture, social structure is really less clear. And this is where this paper is trying to contribute. So this is really a frontier area of research. Quick summary of the paper. In Sweden, the spread of railways led to the spread of social movements. And here we're specifically talking about these 4 organizations: temperance organizations, free churches, unions, and left party organizations. And then Eric didn't get to this in the presentation, but they are also linked to turnout in the 1911 general election. The mechanism that's put forth here is they contribute to a contagion of ideas. Organizational leaders are traveling around the railways and spreading these ideas, and people that are adopting them. This is all based on very nice parish level economic and geographic data from 1850 all the way to 1900. And this new interesting data set that I didn't know much about, the Swedish Social Movement Archive. And importantly, Eric is contributing a lot on the railway data set here, and that nice thing you mentioned about freight and passengers coming to stations. I think that's really exciting data. Panel data methods are employed. The main outcome is presence or membership of an organization in a parish and year. And that's going to be then related to when the railway arrives in your parish. And distance to a planned network is the instrument. So my comments here are that overall this is a comprehensive analysis, but I think a lot more tightening and interpretation is needed. And I want to stress the link to the 1911 general election. I think that makes this more of an interesting economic history paper. All right. Just to give everyone a quick sense, Eric can show these maps. Might be good just to look at them again. Visualization of what the findings are. The red dots are places where they have these organizations. Black lines are the railway. Okay. And the black dots are the parish. So you just look closely, it passes the ocular test. There's a lot of organizations near rail lines. Okay. In terms of the instrument, here the red line is the key condition. This is the planned routes according to one of these plans. And you can see in Sweden, they generally sort of follow the plan. And they build railways nearby, and that's going to give the variation that Eric can exploit. The event study graphs really nicely show you the results. So this is looking at when you get, for every parish, the biggest reduction in distance to rail, the big bang moment when the rail arrived, if you will. What are the patterns in presence and membership of organizations around that date? And you see that there is indeed this sort of takeoff of organizations post big bang of railway exposure. All right, so my comments here are general and conceptual. I have a couple of slides here, comments, but I wanted more explanation of these organizations, what they're about, their leaders, what ideas are being spread. This is being a little bit harsh, but I feel like there's sort of a vague mention of challenging the conservative order. And I think this paper needs a lot more about the ideas being discussed. I want more theory and hypothesizing on how social movements spread, especially via organizations. And I get the idea that communication costs and coordination are really crucial here, but is there more that we need to know? Are these social movements a reaction to certain shocks like industrialization? I think that could be fleshed out more. I was also curious about the conservatives. Where were they in this story? Why weren't they responding to these groups emerging and challenging their order? I mean, maybe since they were the established power, they didn't feel like they had to react. That strikes me as sort of strange. So I wanted to know more about what they were up to. Maybe they spread their ideas differently. And then I want to just challenge the mechanism a little bit. So to me, there's a lot of things that could happen at the parish level when a railway would arrive that might generate these outcomes that I think are underexplored. So my logic here is that social movements are probably more common in densely populated parishes and also those with more secondary and tertiary occupations. And since railways contribute to that, I would think that would be the primary channel. Your parish became industrialized and people started to create these organizations and participate in them. But that's not the argument of the authors. The way they try to dismiss this channel by putting population and occupation on the right-hand side, but I think it would be more interesting to make their outcome variables per capita. So organizations per capita or per agricultural, non-agricultural occupations, so we can see the intensity of organizational creation that would get at, like, not just did you have more population, but then did that given population organize more? Okay, on the empirics, I won't go through sort of the discussion of the instrument, just a little bit more sharpening of the explanation necessary here. One thing that I found a little bit odd is that often in these studies, we use a railway plan. Removing the targeted cities is quite crucial. So Stockholm would be the targeted city in the scenario. And I found it curious that removing places like Stockholm, I guess parish of Stockholm or related parishes, didn't change the estimates. That was a little surprising to me. But maybe the biggest thing to be concerned about at this point is that the IB estimate is actually 8 times larger than OLS. And, maybe the selection bias should be that big, but I mean, that needs to be explained, right? When you get such a big difference between the two. The role of market access, I think, has to be a lot more developed. What channel is being tested here? How does it correlate with conventional measures of market access to the population? Is in there? Are passenger costs included? All that kind of stuff. Last thing here, explain why Sweden is an interesting case. The classic explanations had large-scale immigration, high levels of human capital. I should also add, of course, the 20th century emergence of the welfare state in Sweden. Use that to make your study, maybe catch a broader audience. I wanted more about the state versus private railways. That just comes up in this literature. But last but not least, I think it's hard to really, in the current draft, to understand the importance of the 1911 election and how these social movements contribute to that. And I can imagine some editor referee maybe trying to tell you to drop that, but I think that's really interesting. And I think it makes it more of a cool economic history paper, a more of a unique paper. And I would say don't drop it. I would expand it. And I would cut back elsewhere to do that. So I would try to directly answer, I think, a fascinating question at the bottom, which is, how did railways contribute to democratic participation via these social movements? That I think is the really interesting question. But you need to do that much more. Okay, that's it.
Are there any questions or comments? Okay, I think anybody online want to say anything? So thank you for a great session. I think all the presentations were really good. And so anyway, that's the end. So have a great time. Thanks for coming, and we will see you next year in La Crosse and from there on. So Eric, great job.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.